Today our story is about Leon Davidovich Trotsky, a man who dreamed of reshaping the world according to his own blueprints. He was as sharp as a razor, as eloquent as an ancient tribune, and as dangerous as a storm born from a quiet wind. The name Trotsky became a symbol of revolutionary passion and political intrigue. To the West, he would be known as the prophet of the revolution. But inside the Kremlin, he was the only man Joseph Stalin truly feared. For some, he was a hero and a genius of tactics. For others, a ruthless fanatic, ready to sacrifice millions for an idea. He rose from a young dreamer in a distant Kherson village to one of the primary leaders of the revolution, commanded armies, created new states, and toppled old empires. But then he lost everything: his home, his family, his homeland, and, in the end, his very life. Trotsky was not merely a witness to the events of the early 20th century. He was their driving force. He wrote books in freezing prison cells, conducted negotiations in opulent palaces, and fought in the mud of the trenches. His life is a chronicle of triumphs and tragedies that mirrored the fate of an entire century. We will walk this path together. From the quiet steppes of Kherson to the roaring streets of Petrograd. From the hot halls of revolutionary rallies to the cold walls of emigrant hotels. And we will end in distant Mexico, where an ice pick would forever put a point to this story. Childhood in the steppes of Kherson. The year is 1879, late autumn in the south of the Russian Empire, Kherson province, a district between Elizabethgrad and Nikolaev. In this steppe belt, where wheat stretches to the horizon and roads disappear into the dusty haze, Leon Davidovich Bronstein is born. The Bronstein house stands on the outskirts of Yanovka, a village with whitewashed huts, low barns, wells, and orchards, where apple trees bend to the ground after a warm summer. His father, David Leontievich, was a strong, calculating, and stubborn man who earned his living through farming and grain deals. He knew how to argue over prices and did not like empty talk. His mother, Anna Lvovna, was softer and more educated. She brought a habit of reading and a respect for study to the house, and it was her hand that first led the boy to a book. The Kherson steppes at that time were not a serene idyll, but a vibrant market of labor and hopes. Ukrainian farmhands went into the fields. Neat craftsmen worked in nearby German colonies. Traders wandered through fairs, and in taverns, they argued about prices, harvests, and news of capital politics. All this colorful mix of languages and faces created the background against which the boy's sensitivity to words, conflict, injustice, and order was formed. An order that seemed as fragile as the thin ice of March ponds. Leova's childhood passed among household chores, the changing of seasons, and the conversations of adults about business. In the house, they often counted bags of grain, discussed the weather and roads, and argued about who to trust with transport and how to manage without unnecessary overpayments. The boy's hearing caught everything, from curses on the threshing floor to rare newspaper articles someone brought from the district. He early on got used to numbers, precision, and responsibility for one's word. Because in the South, a word is often the pledge of a deal and a guarantee of reputation. His first school was a local one. Teachers saw a student with a vivid memory and a rapid mind who asked more than was required by the program. Leova read quickly, accurately wrote out the letters, but especially loved problems where he had to find a pattern, compare facts, and derive a general principle. He liked not just to know, but to understand how a device was built, why a wheel rotates, why the sum of the angles of a triangle is equal to 2 right angles, and what stood behind a short newspaper line about a strike at a factory in the capital. Family life, meanwhile, taught him persistence. His father demanded discipline and respect for work. His mother demanded diligence and a love of reading. At home, they did not welcome empty daydreams. But by evening, books inevitably appeared, and the boy, hiding from conversations about the price of a pud and the moisture of grain, escaped into the world of the printed word. At first, these were textbooks, then historical sketches, and later, journalism, where the names of people arguing about the future of Russia appeared. In the villages around Yanovka, things were restless. Sometimes anxiety was brought by rumors of pogroms, sometimes by talk of taxes. The boy heard adults whispering about police chiefs and how, in the empire, much was decided not by law, but by connections and fear. These conversations were stored in his memory not as a finished political program, but as an emotional experience. There are the strong and the weak. There is power and lawlessness. There are promises and consequences. Lyova's teenage years were associated with a move to a larger city for continued study, where schools were stricter, programs wider, and libraries richer. The city opened a different rhythm of life to him. The ringing of trams, the smell of printer's ink, and the silence of reading rooms where he could hold books that were only heard of in the district. Here he became acquainted with new vocabulary: revolution, socialism, strike, trade union. Words that still sounded like mysterious passwords, but already attracted him with their logic and daring. A merchant at a fair was his own mathematics of profit. A clerk in an office was a ritual of power and paper. A locksmith in a workshop was the honor of a craft and respect for hands. Each of them lived by their own rules, and the boy tried to understand why some rules were higher than others, and who wrote these rules. By the end of his teenage years, a habit of dispute was formed. Lyova argued with teachers and classmates, looking for weak spots in evidence and unable to tolerate empty rhetoric. He was drawn to circles where forbidden magazines were read aloud, discussing books and distributing lecture notes that were passed around like treasures. He learned that the printed word could be a weapon no weaker than a saber, and sometimes even stronger, because it changes not the external order, but the internal foundations of human actions. In the family, tension grew between the father's strict practicalism and the son's intellectual interests. The father wanted to see a successor for the farm, someone who knew how to count the harvest and the price of fodder. The son thought more and more about a world wider than barns and fields, and about justice that could not be reduced to an honest measure and exact weight. This quiet quarrel, still without harsh words, became his first school of internal independence. His final school years passed under the sign of acceleration. Thick books were read, long notes were taken, and references, names, formulas, and dates appeared in the margins. Together with his comrades, Lyova discovered texts where history was explained as a chain of causes and effects, where economic forces moved politics and ideas turned into a material force when they took hold of the masses. These thoughts fell on the fertile soil of the southern province, where the contrast between wealth and poverty was seen not in theory, but in the nearest courtyard. As his studies ended, two paths appeared. One, a quiet road of family business. The other, a path of questions, meetings, illegal literature, and risk. He chose the second, and this decision became the border between childhood and the future biography of a man who would be written about as both a leader and an enemy. This chapter is about the roots from which character grows, about the step horizon that taught him to look far, about the precision of thought from numbers and books, and about a provincial life where contrasts were so sharp they demanded explanation and action. Youth, books, and first arrests. The last years of the 19th century brought a sense of a coiled spring to the Russian Empire. In the cities of the South, talk of socialists and mysterious organizations was increasingly heard. Leon Bronstein was already studying in the Nikolaev Real School. This city gave him access to a large library and illegal literature. Here he first held the books of Marx and Engels. At first, he was a reader, but soon he began to argue with the authors, making marks in the margins. Nikolaev, at the end of the century, was a city of shipbuilders and port workers. In the evenings, in tea houses, one could hear the heavy voices of dockers complaining about low pay. Lev was increasingly among these people, listening and asking questions. He understood that behind dry figures were hungry families. Soon, he joined the Southern Russian Workers' Union, one of the first Marxist organizations in the South. They met in the back room of a workshop under the light of a kerosene lamp. Lev, not yet 20, became one of the most active participants. He was distinguished by his ability to write so that people wanted to read. Parallel to this, he dove into underground work, spreading proclamations and organizing meetings. Police in Nikolaev knew of the circles, but could not arrest everyone at once. However, the risk of surveillance was real. This risk became reality in early 1898. After a meeting, gendarmes entered the house where Lev was staying. Search, overturned papers, confiscated notebooks, and arrest. This first imprisonment taught him two things: not to trust unnecessary people, and to always be ready for interrogation. Prison life in Nikolaev was not romantic. Cold cells, rude guards, and the weight of waiting. But Lev used this time as a school, reading everything he could get, from history textbooks to forbidden treatises. In his cell, he met experienced revolutionaries who told stories of exile and escapes. Through a few months, he was sent to his first exile in eastern Siberia. The journey was long and exhausting. But it was in exile that Lev realized returning to a quiet life was no longer possible. He wrote letters to friends, discussed plans for escape, and dove deeper into theory. Siberia became a school of endurance. It was during this period that his legendary pseudonym was born. He borrowed the name Trotsky from his head jailer, whose authoritative character made a deep impression on him. He decided to return to the underground and do everything to enter the center of the movement. Exile and Escape from Siberia. He had to break away from the hands of the Tsar's police. Siberia was a network of penal settlements, transit prisons, and remote villages. The journey was slow. First, an arrestee carriage where it was crowded and cold. Then, overcrowded transit prisons where political and criminal prisoners mixed. From seasoned convicts, he learned about escape methods and how to bribe a guard. From political exiles, about secret organizations and newspapers never seen in public sale. His place of exile was a village in the Irkutsk province. He was supposed to spend 4 years there under the supervision of a local constable. But for Lev, this was the beginning of a carefully constructed plan. First, he established contacts among exiles. Through them, he received instructions from the Vola. One of these letters proposed an escape route. In winter, through the taiga to the railway. He understood that escape was a deadly risk, but staying meant wasting his best years. He obtained permission to work outside the house, formally helping a local blacksmith. This allowed him to study the terrain and the guard posts. While many historians mistakenly say he fled in 1899, the escape actually took place in August 1902. To deceive the guards, Trotsky constructed a dummy out of clothes and a blanket in his bed, a double to create the appearance of a sleeping person during night checks. He himself, hidden at the bottom of a hay cart under a mountain of grass, slowly drove out of the settlement. He moved through the frozen river and into the forest where the snow hid his tracks. For several days, he made his way to the railway station. A ticket, a short conversation with a controller, and a train took him away. Soon he was in Samara, and from there, Moscow. Here he contacted Podpolshchiki and got new documents. The goal, London, where Vladimir Lenin lived. London, Lenin, and party splits. There, in the editorial rooms of Iskra, a new stage of his life was to begin. London met the emigrant with damp cobblestone streets and the noise of ports. Here, among others, were Russian Marxists gathered around the newspaper Iskra. Trotsky arrived in London in 1902. The goal was to get into the center of revolutionary thought, where the program of the future party was being formed. Iskra was not just a newspaper. It was a weapon and a symbol. Its editor-in-chief, Vladimir Lenin, maintained strict discipline and demanded uncompromising debate. Young Trotsky quickly proved himself a brilliant publicist. However, already from the first months, it became clear there were differences between him and Lenin. Trotsky valued discussion and freedom of expression within the movement. Lenin believed without strict discipline, the party would collapse. These disagreements first expressed themselves in editorial disputes. In the editorial room on Clerkenwell Green, one could hear the voices of arguing men for hours. Lenin, clear, logical, and sharp. Trotsky, emotional and witty. For participants, this was a struggle for the very image of the revolution. The party was preparing for the Second Congress of the Social Democratic Labour Party in London. The Congress became a turning point where the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks diverged. Trotsky switched to the side of the Mensheviks, believing that Lenin's centralism would lead to the suppression of internal democracy. This choice forever remained a shadow in their relationship. Life in London was not just politics. He studied the city and its trade unions. He liked observing how working-class organizations developed in England. By the end of the London period, Trotsky had gained a reputation as a talented publicist of the movement. But he also gained enemies who considered him too independent and incapable of submitting to discipline. These characteristics would accompany him for his entire life. The Revolution of 1905. In early 1905, the Russian Empire was cracking at the seams. Throughout the country, factories hummed, and in working-class quarters, the whisper of revolution was no longer a secret. Trotsky was living in Europe, but the news of Bloody Sunday forced him to return home. He understood he was risking his freedom. In October, he arrived in Petrograd under a false name. It was during these days that the Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies began its work. Trotsky, thanks to his oratory talent, soon became its leading figure and then its chairman. His speeches gathered hundreds. He knew how to present ideas, so they became a personal matter for every listener. However, the authorities were not going to put up with the Soviet. The meeting of the Soviet was surrounded by police, and everyone present was arrested. Trotsky found himself in prison, but continued to write articles. The trial became a loud political event, where Trotsky turned the sessions into a platform to accuse the government. Newspapers could not fully silence his speeches. The sentence was harsh: exile to Siberia, his second time. But now he was a politician whose name was known in the working-class districts. The Siberian exile did not last long. He organized another escape and went abroad to analyze the lessons of the revolution. These conclusions would become the basis for his theory of permanent revolution. In 1917, he would change the fate of Russia. Emigration and political struggle. After his escape in early 1906, Trotsky lived in Germany, France, and finally Austria. His name was already known in European social democratic circles. Europe in those years was boiling with political life. Trotsky quickly entered this environment, speaking at rallies and writing articles. His style stood out. He knew how to combine political sharpness with literary expressiveness. In Vienna, where he lived for nearly 7 years, Trotsky founded his own Russian newspaper, Pravda. It had influence among workers in Russia. Trotsky sent the newspaper through secret channels, and its copies often fell directly into the hands of workers in Petrograd. At the same time, he was drawn into the disputes between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Trotsky called himself a supporter of party unification. He believed the split weakened the movement. However, both Lenin and the Menshevik leaders treated his position with suspicion. During this time, his theoretical views were formed, arguing that the working class in Russia must transition to socialist transformations supported by a world revolution. This concept differed sharply from both the Menshevik and Leninist strategies. Despite the disputes, Trotsky did not drop out of the revolutionary network. He established connections that would play a role in years of revolution. Life in emigration was not easy. The family lived in constant instability. Meanwhile, in Russia, a new political crisis was brewing. European events strengthened Trotsky in the thought that a new revolutionary explosion in Russia was inevitable. These years would be a preparation for events of 1912 and 1917. He entered them as an experienced politician and theorist. In the moment when on the streets of Russia, the fires of revolution would light again. 1917. The Path to Power. February. 1917 changed Russia instantly. The capital, exhausted by war, lack of bread, and a fuel crisis, exploded with mass strikes and street demonstrations. Soldiers, tired of the front-line trenches and senseless orders, went over to the side of the protesters. Tsarist power was collapsing literally before one's eyes. At this time, Leon Trotsky was in New York, where he had moved at the beginning of the year to work in the Russian-language socialist newspaper, The New World. He wrote articles about the war, capitalism, and the prospects of revolution. But the news of the overthrow of Nicholas II caught him at his editorial desk and immediately changed his plans. Within a few days, he decided to return to Russia. For the American viewer, it is important to understand his life in the Bronx. He lived at 1522 Vice Avenue, paying only $18 a month for a small apartment. He was fascinated by the industrial power of New York, calling the subway the mechanical heart that moved the masses with capitalist precision. He spent his days in the offices of The New World on St. Mark's Place, debating the coming storm in Russia. The road was not easy. Traveling through Europe, gripped by war, turned out to be impossible. So Trotsky, together with a group of revolutionaries, set off across the Atlantic. In Canada, he was detained by British authorities. They feared he was heading to Russia to lead propaganda against the Allies. He spent several weeks in an internment camp, but, under public pressure and with the mediation of socialist organizations, he was released. In May, he finally arrived in Petrograd. The city already lived a new political life. The provisional government, the Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies, and parties of all directions were fighting for influence. Trotsky immediately joined this struggle. His oratory talent made him one of the brightest figures of revolutionary Petrograd. He spoke at rallies, in factory workshops, in barracks, and on the streets. His speeches were precise, emotional, and relied on concrete facts. In the summer of 1917, he joined the Bolsheviks. Disagreements with Lenin, stretching from the beginning of the century, gave way to common goals: the overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of Soviet power. Lenin appreciated the scale of his influence on the masses and his political determination. In July, during the so-called July Days, Trotsky was among those demanding an immediate transition of power to the Soviets. For this, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Kresty. But in September, after the coup attempt by General Kornilov, he was released, and the Bolsheviks received a sharp surge in popularity. Trotsky was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. In this post, he became a key figure in preparing the October uprising. It was he who developed the plan for seizing strategic objects in the capital and ensured interaction between worker detachments, soldiers, and sailors of Kronstadt. The night from October 24th to October 25th, 1917, became the moment when theory turned into action. By his order, Red Guard detachments occupied bridges, stations, the post office, and the telegraph. In the evening, revolutionary forces entered the Winter Palace, arresting the ministers of the provisional government. Power passed to the Soviets, and Leon Trotsky became one of the main victors of this revolution. Ahead of him lay not rallies and debates, but the leadership of a new army that had to defend Bolshevik power in the conditions of the approaching civil war. The People's Commissar and the Armored Train. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks power, but not peace. A collapsed army, destroyed infrastructure, and economic catastrophe threatened the existence of the new government. In November 1917, Trotsky received the post of People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. He spoke brilliantly on the international stage, but in early 1918, he was appointed to the far more dangerous position of People's Commissar for Military Affairs. The revolution required an army, and it had to be created from zero. The Red Army at that moment existed only on paper. Trotsky insisted on the restoration of strict discipline, introduced a system of commissars, and even recruited former officers of the Tsarist army, forcing them to swear allegiance to the new power. To manage the fronts, Trotsky created a mobile headquarters in a state on wheels, his legendary armored train. This train was a steel monster of 12 heavily armored cars, including a library, a radio station, and even a couple of luxury Rolls-Royce cars on platforms for rapid deployments to the front lines. His personal guard, the Black Guard, were dressed from head to toe in black leather, striking terror into friend and foe alike. On this train, he appeared at the most dangerous points of the front, personally checking discipline and conducting military councils. The Civil War was merciless. Each front required attention, resources, and skillful command. Trotsky did not hesitate to use harsh measures: executions for desertion, show trials, and rigid distribution of resources. In August 1918 at Sviazhsk, Trotsky carried out a brutal decimation. He ordered every 10th soldier in a regiment that had retreated without orders to be shot. This ancient Roman practice proved that the revolution would kill its own to ensure victory. By 1920, the Red Army had turned into a powerful military force. Trotsky played a key role in this. However, his growing influence caused alarm in Lenin and especially in Stalin. Within the party, the struggle for future leadership was already beginning, and Trotsky, with his charisma and popularity in the army, was becoming a dangerous competitor. Victory in the Civil War did not bring him long-term political triumph. Instead, sharp conflicts within the party would gradually push him out of power. Civil War and Bolshevik victory. By the beginning of 1920, the Civil War reached its decisive stage. The White armies began to suffer defeats. One of the most difficult fronts for Trotsky was the Southern Front. There, the remnants of white units were supported by weapons and ammunition from the Entente. The Red Army fought fierce battles, and Trotsky personally controlled operations, moving along the front line in his armored train. His presence on the front line gave the soldiers confidence, but it was also a demonstration that the command was ready to share the danger with them. In Ukraine, the situation was especially complex. Here, besides the whites, the forces of Simon Petliura and the insurgent armies of Nestor Makhno operated. Makhno, with his anarchist detachments, sometimes fought against the whites on the side of the Reds, then entered into conflicts with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky understood that without a tactical alliance with him, victory in the South might be impossible. The concluded agreement allowed forces to be united for a strike on Wrangel in Crimea. The operation to liberate Crimea in November 1920 became one of the final chords of the war. The Red Army, breaking through the defense of Perekop, entered the peninsula and forced the remnants of the white troops to evacuate by sea. This was a major victory, strengthening Trotsky's authority as a military organizer. However, immediately after the defeat of Wrangel, repressions against the Makhnovists began. The Bolsheviks no longer intended to tolerate an independent force. Trotsky supported the decision to liquidate the Makhnovist detachments, believing that unity of power was more important than any temporary alliances. This position brought him criticism from the left, but strengthened his reputation as a man who acts harshly and pragmatically in questions of power. In 1921, the Red Army finally suppressed the main centers of resistance. But victory in the war turned into a heavy peace for the country: ruin, hunger, and discontent. War taught Trotsky that holding power required political stability, which was scarce in the young Soviet Republic. It was at this time that his relations with other party leaders began to deteriorate rapidly. Lenin increasingly expressed dissatisfaction with his harsh methods. Stalin was already building a network of his supporters, preparing for the future struggle for power. Victory in the Civil War made Trotsky one of the most famous and influential politicians, but it also laid the foundation for his political sunset. Conflicts with Lenin and Stalin. After the Civil War, Trotsky found himself in a rare situation. Victory on the fronts did not bring political reinforcement. Relations with Lenin began to crack. Lenin appreciated Trotsky's organizational skills, but feared his political independence. Trotsky, in turn, increasingly criticized the party's economic policy. One sharp episode was the dispute over trade unions in 1921. Trotsky insisted they should become an instrument of economic management, becoming part of the state apparatus. Lenin saw them as an independent force to protect workers. Public discussions turned into a political duel. But even more tense were the relations with Stalin. The psychological gap between them was immense. Trotsky was the intellectual, the master of the world stage. Stalin was the gray blur, the master of the party files. Trotsky once publicly called Stalin the most eminent mediocrity in our party, a comment Stalin would never forget. In return, Stalin whispered in the halls that Trotsky was merely a champion with fake muscles, a man of words but no substance. In 1922, Lenin's health sharply deteriorated. Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev formed a trio to prevent Trotsky's rise. They controlled the party apparatus, isolated his supporters, and systematically undermined his authority. Trotsky continued to work actively, writing theoretical works and developing economic reforms. However, every proposal met with stiff resistance. He was accused of petty bourgeois deviations, and even of striving for dictatorship. The last years of Lenin's life became a time of hidden struggle. Lenin, in his political testament, indicated the need for Stalin's removal. He also recognized Trotsky's talent, calling him the most capable man in the Central Committee, but reproached him for excessive self-confidence. However, Lenin's death in January 1924 made these recommendations useless. After the funeral, the struggle began in the open. Campaigns against Trotskyism began, and Trotsky increasingly found himself in a defensive position. Ahead lay his political isolation, leading him from the Kremlin to a Mexican home surrounded by armed guards. Chapter 11. Exile and Nomadic Life. After Lenin's death, every party meeting turned into a platform for accusations against Trotsky. He was accused of factionalism and violating party discipline. In 1925, he was removed from the post of People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. For the man who created the Red Army, this was a blow to his pride. In 1926, he tried to unite with Zinoviev and Kamenev in the United Opposition. But this alliance was short-lived. The opposition was crushed. In 1927, on the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, Trotsky was expelled from the party. A few weeks later, he was arrested and sent to exile in Alma-Ata. Life there was under constant supervision of the OGPU. Trotsky continued to write books and letters to supporters abroad. In January 1929, he was deported from the Soviet Union. The first country was Turkey, where he lived on Principe Island. He wrote his memoirs and a history of the Russian Revolution there. Then were France and Norway, each with its restrictions. In Norway, under pressure from Moscow, he was isolated from the press. In 1937, he found the last country ready to accept him, Mexico. He arrived at the invitation of artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Stalin's Moscow trials were accompanied by accusations against Trotsky as the main enemy of the people. Soviet special services were working against him, and he knew an assassination attempt was only a matter of time. In his house in the suburbs of Mexico City, he continued to write but lived under constant guard. He avoided several attempts, but in August 1940, his fate was decided. Mexico, Final Days and Assassination. Mexico became the final refuge for Leon Trotsky. Each visitor passed a check, and at night, guards patrolled the courtyard with weapons. Externally, life seemed measured. Trotsky worked in his office from early morning, analyzing the start of the Second World War. But inside, passions boiled. His short but stormy affair with Frida Kahlo became a scandal. She called him El Viejo, the old man, and he wrote her passionate letters hidden in books. Soviet special services were already active in Mexico. In May 1940, 20 gunmen led by the painter David Siqueiros stormed the house. For 20 minutes, they fired over 200 bullets into Trotsky's bedroom. Miraculously, Trotsky and his wife Natalia crawled under the bed and survived while bullets riddled their pillows. Then, Stalin and Beria launched Operation Duck using a sleeper agent. Ramon Mercader gained the trust of Trotsky's circle. On August 21, 1940, he came ostensibly to have an article edited. While the host bent over the papers, Mercader struck him in the head with an ice pick. He chose the ice pick, hoping to kill silently. But Trotsky let out a terrifying, unearthly scream that Mercader said haunted him forever. Trotsky did not die instantly. Severely wounded, he pushed back the attacker and asked the guard not to kill him so he could be interrogated. He was taken to the hospital, but on August 21st, 1940, his heart stopped. News of his death traveled around the world. He was buried in the garden in Coyoacán under a stone with a carved name. Only the name, the years of life, and the silence of the Mexican sky were witnesses to the end of the man who dreamed of reshaping the world. Epilogue. The story of Leon Trotsky is an epic tragedy of a man who created a system that eventually devoured him. He was the architect of ideas that overturned states and a master of words. Trotsky lived life on the limit of human possibilities and remained faithful to his ideas even when they turned him into an outcast. He proved that one person can change history, but history never forgives those who try to control its fury alone. And now, dear viewers, if you are interested in such stories, subscribe to the channel, like, and hit the bell. Because ahead, we have many more stories of people whose lives were full of struggle, secrets, and unexpected finales. And sometimes, ice picks.